Ryan always had trouble sleeping on overnight trains. He loved traveling, but no matter how comfortable the seats or how quiet the car, his mind refused to settle. This trip was no different. He'd boarded the midnight train heading west, thinking he could at least rest his eyes, but instead, he found himself staring out the window into the endless darkness. Fields and forests blurred past in the dim light of the moon. Occasionally, distant towns or lonely houses appeared, their lights flickering like tiny beacons in the night. Ryan sighed, leaned back in his seat, and tried to relax. An hour into the ride, the train suddenly slowed down. At first, Ryan thought they were approaching a station, but when the train came to a full stop, he realized there were no platforms, no signs, no lights, only an expanse of trees and an open field. Curious, he leaned closer to the window. Nothing moved outside except the swaying branches of the trees. Other passengers in his car remained quiet, most either dozing off or buried in their phones. Ryan decided to step out for some fresh air, hoping it would clear his restless mind. As he climbed down onto the gravel beside the tracks, he noticed the sharp chill in the air. The faint smell of damp earth and pine needles filled his lungs. He lit a cigarette and took a long drag, his eyes scanning the shadowy forest. "Not a great spot for a stroll, son," came a gravelly voice behind him. Ryan turned to see the train conductor. The man was older, with a weathered face and a faded navy uniform. His cap sat slightly askew, and his stern expression suggested he'd been doing this job far too long. "Is everything okay?" Ryan asked, gesturing toward the stalled train. The conductor gave a slow nod. "Just a minor issue. Nothing to worry about, but you'd best stay close to the train. It's not safe to wander out here." "Not safe? Why's that?" The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the trees. "Just stay near the train, son. And when you're done out here, get back to your seat. We'll be moving soon enough." Ryan frowned but nodded. The conductor tipped his cap and walked off toward the front of the train, his flashlight casting long, flickering beams into the dark. Ryan finished his cigarette and was about to climb back aboard when something caught his eye. Deep in the forest, just beyond the first line of trees, he saw movement. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then it became clear. Someone was standing there. The figure was tall, dressed in clothes that looked eerily familiar. Ryan squinted, his heart skipping a beat. The person looked exactly like him. Not just similar, identical. The face was his own, but pale and lifeless. The body stood unnaturally still, arms hanging limply at its sides. Its eyes, though open, seemed empty, staring blankly into the night. Ryan's pulse quickened. His legs felt frozen in place, but some invisible force, urged him forward. He stepped closer to the edge of the tracks, trying to get a better look. "Hey!" he called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. He took another step, and then another. Gravel crunched under his feet as he crossed the tracks, his eyes locked on the motionless figure. A strange hum filled the air, a low, almost inaudible vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As Ryan approached the tree line, a hand grabbed his shoulder. "Stop." He spun around to see the conductor standing behind him, his expression grave. "What the hell are you doing?" the older man barked, pulling Ryan back toward the train. I saw someone out there," Ryan stammered. "It looked like me. Exactly like me." The conductor's grip tightened. "You don't go into the woods here. Ever. Understand?" Ryan tried to protest, but the man shook his head and guided him firmly back to the train. Once they were both aboard, the train jolted to life, slowly pulling away from the eerie clearing. Ryan sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He turned to the conductor, who had taken a seat across the aisle, his flashlight resting on his lap. "Who was that out there?" Ryan asked, his voice low. The conductor exhaled deeply, his weathered face shadowed by the dim overhead lights. "It's not a who. It's a what?" Ryan stared at him, waiting for an explanation. "This stretch of track," the conductor began, "isn't like the others. Strange things happen here. Trains break down. People vanish. We call it the Bermuda Triangle of the rails. Ryan's stomach tightened. People vanish? What do you mean? The conductor's gaze shifted to the window. Sometimes passengers decide to step off like you did. They see things that aren't really there. Or maybe they are. All I know is, once they go into those woods, they don't come back. Ryan felt a chill crawl up his spine. But I saw myself out there. How is that possible? The conductor shrugged. Some say this place shows you what it wants you to see. Your fears, your regrets, your shadow. Doesn't matter what it is. If you follow it, you're gone. Lucky for you, I stopped you in time. Ryan leaned back, his thoughts swirling. The image of his lifeless double lingered in his mind. Why does this happen? He asked quietly. No one knows, the conductor replied. But I've been riding these tracks for over 30 years, and I've seen enough to know when to intervene. He stood, adjusting his cap. Get some rest, son. We'll be at the next station soon. Ryan watched as the conductor disappeared into the next car. He turned back to the window, but the forest and fields had already given way to distant city light. He never took the midnight train again. Alex was used to long and tedious trips. Working as a manager for a large company, he frequently traveled between cities on night trains. This time, his journey was to a small town where the company was opening a new branch. He booked his ticket in advance, choosing compartment 14, located in the middle of the car, far from the noisy entrance doors and restrooms. When Alex boarded the train, the car was nearly empty. The conductor, a tall man with a tired face, quickly checked his ticket, glanced briefly at the compartment number, and wished him a good night. Approaching the door with the number 14, Alex tried to open it, but it was locked. Puzzled, he looked around, but the conductor had already disappeared to the other end of the car. Turning toward the neighboring compartment, Alex noticed that the door labeled 13 was slightly ajar. Maybe there's been a mix-up with the numbers, he thought, reaching for the door. Inside the compartment, he found an odd sight. Instead of the standard modern interior of train cars, there were wooden panels, vintage lamps with frosted glass, and heavy burgundy curtains. The furniture looked like it had survived several decades. The whole scene reminded Alex of old photographs of trains from the early 20th century. In the corner sat a man in a gray suit and hat. He was silently reading a newspaper, his legs crossed in polished, gleaming shoes. Sorry, I think I've got the wrong compartment, Alex said, ready to leave. No mistake, the man replied quietly, without lifting his eyes from the paper. This is your place. Something in the man's voice made Alex freeze in place. He felt a strange chill, seemingly coming from the walls. Despite this, he decided to stay. All right, maybe they just messed up the ticket, he muttered, placing his belongings. The man didn't ask any questions or show interest. He kept reading, and Alex, tired after the day, decided to lie down. Barely had he closed his eyes when a faint sound woke him. It wasn't the usual hum of the train, but a strange whisper coming from the wall. Alex listened, trying to make out the words, but all he could hear was incomprehensible murmuring. He sat up, scanning the compartment. The man in the hat was still in his seat, but now without the newspaper. His face was turned toward Alex, his unblinking eyes seemingly fixed on him. Did you hear that? Alex asked, a shiver running down his spine. It's not allowed here, the man replied. What isn't allowed? The man said nothing. He simply turned to the window and began whispering to himself again. Alex decided to step out into the corridor to find the conductor and figure out what was going on. But when he stepped outside, he found the car deserted. No sounds, no passengers, only the dim light of the lamps and the hum of the train. He walked to the neighboring compartment, where his ticket indicated he should be, but the number 14 was gone. In its place was another door with the number 13. What the hell? Alex muttered, looking around. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Alex turned and saw the conductor approaching. The man was carrying an old lantern, its dim light as weak as the car's lamp. "You should return to your compartment," the conductor said softly. "To mine? My compartment is 14. There's some kind of mistake." The conductor shook his head. "There is no compartment 14 in this car." "What do you mean?" "I bought a ticket for it." "Return to your place while the train is still moving," the conductor said coldly, turning and walking away. Confused, Alex returned to the compartment. The man in the hat was no longer sitting in the corner. Instead, his newspaper lay neatly on the seat. Alex picked it up and felt his heart race. On the front page was an article dated 1954 with the headline, "Tragedy on the Night Express. Passengers in compartment 13 perish in fire." The photo showed the same man in the hat, only lifeless, sitting in a burned-out compartment. Before Alex could process what he was reading, the train suddenly stopped. The lights flickered, and loud thuds came from the walls, as if someone was desperately trying to break through. Alex rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a voice behind him spoke. "You shouldn't have come in here." He turned to see the man in the hat. This time, his face was charred, and black tears streamed from his empty eyes. Alex screamed, but everything vanished in an instant. He woke to a knock on the door. "You're stopped, sir," the regular conductor said, standing at the doorway. Alex stumbled out of the compartment, panicking. But as he passed the door labeled 13, he noticed it was shut tight, and the number plaque looked brand new. When he stepped onto the platform, he heard a whisper behind him. "You'll be back." Later, Alex discovered that compartment 13 had been officially sealed after a fire claimed its passengers 70 years ago. Yet sometimes, its doors reopen for those destined to become part of its dark history. Thomas always loved traveling. He found a certain magic in trains, the rhythmic clatter of wheels, the mist outside the windows, and rare conversations with strangers who seemed to know something important about life. But lately, his trips had lost their charm and turned into a necessity. Working in another city forced him to take late-night trains every day, returning home well past midnight, when the streets were deserted and the town seemed abandoned. One night, exhausted after a long workday, Thomas arrived at an old station. The electronic board wasn't working, and the walls had only faded paper maps of the routes. The place was empty. Even the ticket clerk was nowhere to be seen, though the ticket booth was open. He glanced around and noticed an old man in a worn-out coat walking toward him. "Need a late-night train?" the man rasped, staring directly into Thomas's eyes. The old man looked strange. His skin was grayish, his gaze dull, and he held an old paper ticket that didn't resemble the modern ones. "Well, yeah," Thomas replied hesitantly. "Is the ticket office closed?" "It's closed, son. But I've got a couple of spare tickets. Take one. You won't regret it," the old man said in a voice that sounded like it came from two places at once. Thomas took the ticket. It was yellowed, with faded lettering and a strange logo from a company he'd never heard of. "Does this train really run?" Thomas asked, feeling a twinge of unease. "Oh, it runs, son. Non-stop," the man replied. The old man shuffled away, leaving Thomas alone on the platform. A few minutes later, with an unfamiliar hissing sound, a train emerged from the darkness. It looked ancient, as if it had been pulled out of another time. A metal body streaked with soot, grimy windows, and a faint odor of rust. Thomas hesitated but eventually boarded the last car. Inside, a strange silence hung in the air. A few passengers sat motionless, staring blankly at nothing. Nobody moved, spoke, or even breathed audibly. Thomas sat by the window, avoiding their gaze. The train started moving smoothly, almost soundlessly. He pulled out his phone to pass the time, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The battery was suddenly dead, though it had been at 70% just minutes ago. Resigned, Thomas tried to relax, but an odd feeling gnawed at him. It was too cold in the car, and the passengers remained eerily still. After about 30 minutes, the train abruptly slowed down. Thomas looked out the window and saw no station, no city, just an endless field shrouded in thick fog. "Why are we stopping?" he muttered, glancing at the man sitting across from him. The man slowly turned his head, and Thomas felt his stomach drop. The passenger's face was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed to look straight through Thomas, as if he weren't really there. "It's time to get off," the man rasped, his voice echoing through the car. The doors slid open. The passengers rose simultaneously, like puppets, and began silently exiting the train. Thomas wanted to shout to stop them, but he couldn't move. He felt an invisible force pushing him toward the door. Once outside, he looked around. The field stretched endlessly, and the train stood still in the dense fog. One by one, the people began to vanish. They dissolved into thin air, as if they had never existed. "This is just a dream, Thomas whispered to himself, but everything felt too real. He turned back to the train, but the doors shut in his face. He pounded on them, but the train began to move, leaving him behind in the middle of nowhere. "Hey, wait," he shouted, but the train disappeared into the fog as if it had never been there. Thomas was alone now. The field around him remained unchanged, as if time itself had stopped. In the distance, he heard footsteps, and the old man emerged from the fog, the same one who had given him the ticket. "I told you, son, non-stop," the old man said, his eyes glowing faintly with an eerie light. Thomas wanted to ask something, but the words stuck in his throat. The old man extended another ticket toward him. This time, it bore a single word: return. As Thomas reached out for the ticket, the old man vanished, and he heard the familiar sound of a train. The same car emerged from the fog and stopped in front of him. "Well, are you getting back on?" a voice whispered in his head. Thomas didn't have time to answer before the doors opened again.